So this new political season in Croatia started with somewhat good news. The Fitch credit rating agency upgraded Croatia's outlook. So this kind of is this a kind of approval for the government's policy? What implications could it have?
I think that is good news for the Croatian government, definitely. And I think that credit agency in developing countries like Croatia have a lot of problems because in a lot of time they need to estimate what is a kind of functioning of governmental bodies instead of analysis of policies efficiency. So we have a very interesting situation. On one way, we have definitely better functioning of Ministry of Finance in comparison to the previous government. But on another side, we have bad news about competitiveness, about GDP and raise of unemployment.
So are you saying that the assessment of Fitch might not be very correct because of the difficulties the credit agencies have to?
No, I would like to say that it needs to be fit to the developing countries because we have not a strong tradition in case of democracy and we have not good transparent public policy in comparison to the for example Western economies countries. So they need in stronger manner more thoroughly they need to research and analyze what's about functioning of government body instead of policy efficiency analysis, as it be in case, for example, Austria or Germany.
In their assessment, Fitch says that it's actually all the government's actions that led to this, the tax revenues they published, all these tax debtors on a website and all other measures. Does this in a way fit into the analysis the institute you work for?
Definitely it works. The Institute of Economics has a strong tradition about macroeconomic and public financing, but in the recent time we take awareness about comparison between Croatia and the similar country, especially in the Southeast Europe and Western Balkans countries, which present some kind of inner circle of Southeast Europe. So on the institute we are aware about the problem and challenge at the same time of approaching Croatia to the European Union, especially my department.
Okay, but it seems that with all these things the government is doing, the analysis that Croatia has a lack of investments, and this is a kind of dragging the country with low. What's the reason for this?
I would like to say that I strongly believe that level of all kind of debt, external and internal debt, really bad signal about investments. Another thing is trend. We are entering in 50 years of the global crisis. Simplicity that is mean that we have some kind of decrease of level of capital and the labor in our national economy. And I would like to say that competitiveness and increase unemployment is only a result, not a result of this kind of model proposed in the last 20 years. And unfortunately, Croatia government Croatia governments in the last 20 years have not recognized on which way solve this problem. Especially, I would like to focus on external debt and illiquidity. Only this government tried to solve a problem of illiquidity and try to give some kind of new measure to decrease this embarrassing level for me.
There's a kind of discrepancy between the analysis of your institute about the debt growth and the government's assessment. It's a little one, but do you expect that actually there is a in this environment, recession environment, lack of investments, and all the troubles that the European Union has now, that actually the debt in an austerity environment could begin to decline, and when?
I would like to say that the first European Union as a body, as some kind of government, as we perceive it, need to recognize which kind of crises are which kind of crises are dominant at the moment. I would like to say, in case of Western Balkans countries and Southeast European countries especially, we have a not stable political structure. So we could talk that instead of financial crisis, that we have some kind of political crisis. So I would like to say that with emphasis on financial crisis, lot of things could be hidden in case of European Union, and focusing on some kind of on the less developed country, for example, on Greece and Slovenia at the moment, and their potential debt default.
So you think that there's too much focus, especially in terms of Croatia, on economics, while there are political problems? Is that what you're saying?
I would like to say that politics without economic power is that it's not work, as economic power couldn't work without politics. So, and we have in that case we have a lot of open question, especially in transition, which definitely have been happening in case of European Union in the last time, when we are witnessing a growing number of supranational institutions.
What could some of these open questions be?
This open question will be definitely could be summarized and simplified in case of euro and the problem sovereignty, because in case of dollar you have a strong country who support its economy and has its monetary policy, its fiscal policy, who really try to support competitiveness. In case of Europe, I think that this sense of supranationality does not work at the moment. So you can not have some kind of stable some kind of political stability. In that case, you are affected in the long run from the problem with financial sector, and it could be depicted as financial crisis.
Yeah, President Barroso this week talked about this, precisely what you're talking about, political crisis, and he proposed as a solution going toward federation. How do you comment on this, and how does Croatia fit in these ideas?
I think that especially I will be that we in Croatia had a lot of experience about federation. Unfortunately, people in Croatia on average don't like talk about it, since this area is a war-affected area from the war conflict. But definitely I think that President Barroso tried to give new impetus towards supranational governments in the European Union. I mean that we had transition in case of Maastricht Agreement in 1992. We abound in some way economic European community and become a European Union. The moment and it was a strong emphasis on the financial sector and some kind of convergence of financial stuff. But the moment and in the last 20 years, unfortunately, political structure definitely lagging behind the financial sector liberalization and creation of supranational structure within the financial sector. At the moment, he tries to find some kind of optimal solution, because I think that in last 20 years the power for Germany and France as the largest European Union countries definitely have grown, and he tried to surge some kind of balance between a lot of number of countries and the largest countries within European Union.
So you think a future federation would kind of balance the power of the bigger countries in the EU
only
now?
difference between ex-Yugoslavia and ex-socialist countries was federation and the strong independence and strong independence policy in a lot of area. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and the main reason was non-market orientation of the business entities, and it didn't work. But I think that European Union should investigate and research in more intensely ex-Yugoslavia and what happened in between all these countries, and a lot of lessons could be learned from this experience.
This would be really interesting and could be a very special contribution for Croatia that Croatia can make for the European Union. Now that the country is less than a year from a full-fledged European Union membership, some analysts say that this could boost economically the country. Do you agree with that?
I think that I talked at the first part of the interview, I talked about functioning of government bodies, and I think that government needs to, make a lot of work in the field of attracting new investments. I don't believe, and I'm strongly against any panacea that we are approaching to the EU and everything will be solved. It's a lot of things depend of us and depend of geostrategical position of Croatia. And I would like to say we are part of Southeast Europe, and I would like to say that that things could be better for the European Union as a whole, and for Croatia especially, if we improve all relation and all economic activities with our neighboring country. And I strongly believe in regional cooperation in Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans countries too.
Is it going to happen? Because it seems that now regional cooperation is in the very beginning.
I think yes, that is true, but I think that introduction of new player and some kind unobserved regional cooperation, it's in European Commission, European Union is more focused on cooperation between policy government, not for example, not include a lot of non-governmental government, but I think that similar heritage and some kind of similar problems, because these countries could be divided at the moment in three groups. For example, we have Bulgaria and Romania with post-accession monitoring process. We have
we call them CVM countries.
We have Slovenia and Greece at the moment with potential debt default problem, and we have other Western Balkans countries. So and the same time, this is the most divergence part of the European Union, part of Europe. For example, difference between Slovenia and Moldova in per capita is 12-fold. So I think there are a lot of area on which way this cooperation could be achieved, and I think that European Union recognize this potential, but I think that stronger political structure and stronger political initiatives from the European Union could lead toward making better things in the field of regional cooperation as a whole.
You mean some kind of European efforts to stimulate the regional cooperation among the countries in the region?
Yeah, because it will be. I'm strongly believe it will be a less problem. This part of Europe will be some kind of it will be a better situation within Southeast Europe in comparison to the current time.
Yes, because this is a good example, because if we see what is happening with the Central European countries, they seem to be in a better position even than the older member states like Poland, the Czech Republic, and they are uniting, the Visegrad group, they are uniting their efforts. Are you talking something about this?
Yeah, I talking about gathering around some good idea, and we can see, for example, in case of Poland and the Czech Republic, especially, they try to give to the European Union some new ideas, especially in the case of monetary sector, and so I think it's very, very good for the European Union. We need to avoid some kind of strict manner, strict way of thinking, and not always to talk about,
not to follow the rules, but to invent new ones.
Invent, because I think for European Union as a whole will be, and then these countries will be crucial on which way these countries contribute to the European Union, or which way they help to them. Because if you check, for example, all websites of all governmental bodies from the local level to the national level in Croatia, you will see that they are specializing for EU funds and for the money for European Union. They don't specializing on which way they will produce some goods, some services for European Union. Yes, they do, but in less manner, in smaller extension in comparison to the attracting EU funds and EU funds to the several pipelines.
Yeah, the government is quite ambitious talking about EU funds, saying that they could hope for the absorption rate of Poland, which is about 70%, is the highest in the EU. Do you think this is overestimation of the capabilities of the country, or is just wishful thinking?
I think I would like to stress attention on difference between Poland and Croatia at the moment. Monetary policy of Poland is different, definitely, and in that way, Poland has, in some sense, different whole economic model in comparison to the Croatia. Unfortunately, in Croatia, we are witnessing for downsizing of average economic situation in terms of GDP. So one measure could not help to the, and one instrument could not help to Croatia at the moment. We need to some kind of on the government level, some kind of increase of functioning of government bodies. Then in some way we need to produce some kind of systematic thinking and not concentrate on one measure that will help to us. I think when you are coming in this kind of community, what is European Union, the contribution will be key question. What can we do for the European Union as a whole? That is my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, to conclude, what do you think is the greatest risk for Croatia's economy prior to EU accession and afterwards?
I think that some good things definitely will happen in case of Croatia approaching to the EU. That is ends with the remains of ex-socialist system, when we have a very stable market structure in some area. And as a result, we are witnessing according to last Croatia Business of Statistics data, increase of prices in this sector. This is food sector, transport sector, and so I strongly believe that European Union needs to give new impetus, new initiatives in creating more competitiveness structure. In case of threat, I think I'm aware about capacity of all people here in Croatia, and I would like to say that some kind of systematic thinking is the worst things. But I think on general level some kind of systematic way of thinking is the area when we need to produce more better results. For example, we are lack of any kind of register. For example, register for public policy. So we could not. We don't believe in policy, that policy could. We believe, but in small extent, that policy could produce good things for us. I think that some kind of new approach and new foundation need to be produced in Croatia if they want to how to say, avoid some kind of non-good scenario in case of European Union, because we are, in case of European Union, we will compete with more organized nations, and in that situation, threat of some kind of losing our identity will appear too, like comparison to the similar nations in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. We are very small in the number.
So if I understood you correctly, what is lacking is some kind of policy thinking and more organized efforts into a direction, long-term direction.
Yeah,
is that so? This is a risk.
Yeah.
Because of the lack of such direction. Is that correct? Okay. I laughed when you started with hoping that the good news is that would be possibly, hopefully, that Croatia would get rid of some of these socialist practices.
Yeah.
But it reminded me that at the very moment, some EU member states, some of them for almost 10 years, that's Hungary, and Romania for 5 years, even Bulgaria, have issues, have some kind of this returning to the socialist thinking, if you like. So I don't want to be, a bad forecaster in that way, but do you think that it is possible that Croatia would in some way resort to this socialist thinking if it doesn't benefit as very well from the EU membership?
I would like to say that socialist kind of thinking I'm against in some way because it doesn't support market competitiveness, and I wouldn't like to draw a line between socialist thinking and unfair market competition. But I believe that a lot of things will depend of our capability to recognize this problem and the capability to create new policy agenda in these fields. And we in Croatia, I think that everyone. That in majority people are against some kind, don't believe in some kind of policy panacea. What could be result by EU membership, but I believe that new membership needs to perceive as some kind of a new hope and for the new action and for the new direction. So in case of introducing only bad things, what will happen in case of EU membership, what is a possible scenario, no one will not approach to the European Union.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.